Welcome to East of Montreal, exploring the biggest adventures in entrepreneurship and innovation on Canada's East Coast, with your host, Alan Gates, and a rotating cast of characters from Tidal Venture Partners.
Welcome to East of Montreal on the Acadia Broadcasting Network, where we look at innovation and entrepreneurship on Canada's East Coast. I'm Alan Gates, and I'm joined today by a new face from Tidal Venture Partners, Duncan McSporn. Duncan is based in Fredericton and has a lot of experience in startups as well as serving in the British Army. Duncan, thanks for helping out today.
Great to be here, Alan, and we're very fortunate to be able to welcome our guest today, Erin O'Toole, to the podcast. Erin's the President Managing Director of ADIT North America, which is a risk advisory firm providing services in strategic intelligence, international trade, due diligence, security and compliance. And I'm sure that most of our listeners will know him as a Member of Parliament, and hopefully a lot of them will know him from his prior service with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a Cabinet Minister and is a former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and he also has some great maritime connections. And Erin, it's just wonderful to have you on the podcast with us today. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Alan. Look forward to the great discussion.
So we'll quiz you on the lyrics to Barrett's Privateers a bit later, just to establish your maritime credentials. You know, your background's in military as well as politics. Political figure with more military experience than almost any other in recent history, certainly a leader. This is an interesting time in defense around the world and in Canada. The current government has pledged to hit 2% of GDP spending on defense this year. It has a target of 5% by 2035. That's billions of dollars of new spending on defense. Can that be done?
Yes, it can. And it is an unusual time. So how I wish I was in Sherbrooke, just to make sure you know that I have some street cred on Barrett's Privateers.
Well played.
No, it is a wild time in the world's history. You know, we're going through a period of deglobalization. So after the globalization that came out of the World War II peace dividend, that's being unwound. We're now going to manage trade, sanction regimes, erosion of intellectual property, privacy rights. We're going through security upheaval with a war in Europe. We're on the doorstep of Europe in Ukraine, tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So as a conservative, I've been very publicly proud of some of the moves Mark Carney has made as Prime Minister to not only recognize the changes in the world, but to act and to make sure that Canada is no longer an unprepared free rider, depending on our alliances in NATO or in NORAD, but that we're going to become a significant participant and we're going to be able to stand on our own. So my speeches that I give now, or I've been giving for several years, are on sovereign capability. We need sovereign capability to do a lot of things ourselves. So the move to hit 2% this year, he is not going to make it, but I'm going to give him a pass on this because we have to do some training to our Coast Guard to have them become a paramilitary type force in order to qualify their budget in our 2%. But he's working so hard, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that one, and I'm not going to measure it closely. We're going to make it in principle, and even the recent announcement about the patrol submarine narrowing down and pushing for maybe a final determination by the end of the year, it's showing a level of ambition that we need. So we can make 2%. I believe we can make over the next few years 3.5%. And then some of our ports, particularly in Atlantic Canada, could be part of the 5%, because that additional 1.5% is for infrastructure, often dual use, where there's a security application as well as an economic or social application. So can we do it? Yes. Do we need to do it? Yes. And I think we do need a Team Canada, which is why I'm surprising people with my positive commentary on the Liberal government, because they're making the right moves.
Yes, you certainly have a different attitude than some of your former colleagues.
I say to my former colleagues, and I'll be honest with you, Alan, I say to them, guys, on pipelines, on the Arctic, on energy, on national defense, we were arguing for all these things. So if the other guys are now going to do it, are we suddenly saying it's not good for the country after we said it for 10 years? So it is frustrating in opposition. I get that. You know, I should charge the Carney government royalties for basically taking my platform from 21 and implementing it in 2025. But tongue-in-cheek comments aside, this is important for Canada. And I say often, I'm a patriot first, a partisan second. Our country has risks. Alliances are eroding. We need to step up. So I'm glad we're stepping up.
So there's lots of areas that we can contribute. It's one of the things that really is continually, it never ceases to amaze me, is the innovative spirit that exists in Canada. What are the areas that you think that we can bring to that coalition, the partnerships that we have, not just with NATO, but with other alliances as well, where you get to see a lot of this going on in a way that very few people are fortunate enough to do. But there are those centers of excellence, those capabilities. What do you think we can be doing to bring that to our own benefit in Canada, but also for the benefit of those other countries that we work with?
Great question, Duncan. I'm going to break it into two parts. Our two key security alliances are the home front, NORAD, and the other one being our global alliance, NATO. With NORAD, Arctic is the simple thing. And I was saying this for 10 years, really, in politics. We weren't doing enough to demonstrate our clear sovereign control and capabilities in our own Arctic waters and landmass. The Americans have been wanting us to do this for years, long before Trump. So I do think in the short term, what we could do, I actually think ballistic missile defense, now called the Golden Dome, which sounds very much like something President Trump would name it, Golden Dome. But if it's guarding our territory, should we not be a part of it? Should we outsource that to the Americans? So I think, some of the technology and investments in over-the-horizon radar that the government's already saying they're going to make could go into homeland security through Arctic sovereignty. And this can enter into our trade negotiations with the US, because the president will want to say that Canada bowed to his will on something like Golden Dome. But if it's in our interest anyway, it's probably something we should agree with. On the NATO side, we've got incredible opportunities for Canadian defense tech companies and traditional Canadian defense companies to really benefit from rising defense spending. NATO has put into innovation a lot of attention, a lot of money. We've seen the NATO Diana program launch in Halifax and have lots of innovation opportunities. We've signed on to the Rearm Europe initiative, which you could almost say is the Rearm NATO initiative, because it is that's where most of the NATO member countries are. And I just want to make sure that signing on to that almost $1 trillion Canadian defense spend opportunity, Rearm Europe, is not just a one-way street, not just Canada buying submarines from Europe and nothing going from Canada to Europe. I really think some of our smaller defense tech companies, some of our innovators, some of which are in Atlantic Canada, can take advantage of the scaling up. And this goes from everything from, ships and targeting systems to cryptography and cyber services. There's a lot of Canadian innovation that we should be really proud of, and we should try and sell.
I couldn't agree more. And in many respects, what we see on a day-to-day basis is the fact that, to your point, somewhere between 70 and 80% of all of the innovation in defence is actually digital. And not only is Canada a leader in that field in so many ways that people just don't understand, but Atlantic Canada is really focused on that as well. And it's great to be able to think about how those technologies can be brought to market in a way which is supportive of our own needs, both from national defence and national security, but also the types of capabilities that are in demand in our partner nations as well. You've got as I started off the discussion with, you've got that resource at your fingertips, which is the fact you've served in uniform as well as doing what you're doing now. I just wonder whether you see a significant role for our veterans in innovation in that way as well, because of the qualities that they bring.
Yes, the simple answer is yes. I see it now. I see it even more so in the future. I'm very proud of my 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. I summarize my time in the military by the description average camper. My joke was, I had to get into politics to have generals call me sir, because I left the forces as a captain. But what I learned at the Royal Military College and what I learned in some of the discussions of strategy, tactics, geopolitics was just Canada's tremendous history and track record, but also our ability to do a lot with little in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'll use an example of the Sea King helicopter and shipborne helicopters, which was my background as a helicopter tactical navigator or TACO. Canada innovated with the hull down and the bear trap system to allow all Allied navies to land maritime helicopters on the back of frigate-size ships. This was Canadian innovation. This was standard, and it was really developed because we couldn't afford to stay in the large ship game, the aircraft carrier game. After the Bonaventure, we weren't going to do that. So we needed to be able to have the air assets on smaller ships. So Canadian innovation drove that and is now the global standard that other countries use variations of the hull down and bear trap. Who did all this innovation, Duncan? In most of these companies, it was ex-airmen, ex-flyers, ex-military people. So I got to see the defense industry a lot in Canada, not just in politics. I helped start the military charity True Patriot Love as a lawyer years ago. And I used to hit up all these companies to support our fundraising for military families and for veterans. And everywhere I went in all of these businesses, there were so many veterans there that wanted to help out. So with veteran employment in defense and security, it's almost like we get a second round of benefit from the investment Canada made in their training and in their development as non-commissioned officers or as officers. So I'm big time in favor of that. When I was a parliamentarian, I worked with people like Mark Garneau and others to create an all-party event on the Hill called Celebration of Service, where we highlighted parliamentarians, MPs and senators who had served, and we would award each year a prize to the companies that had good veteran hiring programs. And it wasn't just defense players like Thales and other ones that won it. It was also companies like Starbucks that has a program that gives free coffee for veterans who want to use Starbucks as a place to meet with other veterans to talk about their transition. So anyone that was helping foster opportunities for veterans, we celebrated. So now that we're stepping up to go to this 3.5 or 5%, we're stepping up Canadian capability. We really need our veterans to step up as well and be part of this industry. We need them to stay in the military a little longer because we've got some personnel shortages. We might have to call you back in, Duncan. But after that, we need, if possible, for a lot of them to help us innovate and help us scale.
Yeah, I think we need to solve the problem of my knees. If we can innovate to replace my knees effectively from 24 years in the infantry, I think I'd be up for that. But I'm not sure anybody else would be. It's interesting because I obviously have a very strong cohort of veteran friends, and a lot of them are working to do exactly as you said. They may not be as influential as the bear trap, and it's such a good example of how Canadian tech, really developed by very capable but experienced veterans, has helped to set world standards. But everything that I hear back from the veterans, and I'm talking to teams here across Atlantic Canada on almost a daily basis, is the obstacles to getting to the point where their technologies, their capabilities, their thought leadership is validated in order to get them to those markets. Because at the end of the day, the Canadian market is one market, but if they're going to be successful and attract investment, they need to be showing that they can export as well. And I just wonder, are there some things that frustrate you in your current role or in your previous roles about those obstacles, and what can we do to try and move those obstacles out of the way?
There are obstacles, but I'll tell you, the obstacles are shrinking and they're being diminished. As you know, the military itself moves very slow on these sorts of innovation issues. But also, years ago, and I spoke to people in the military about this when I was pushing veteran employment, they would say, we don't want to push this too much because it could push people to leave before they're ready to leave. And, we often focus on pilots because it costs $1.5 million per pilot for Canada to train up a pilot to wing standard. And that's old number. It may even be higher than that now. But our Air Force was also losing AVN techs and really specialized technicians that were in high demand in the private sector. So we have to make sure that we incentivize them to stay. We make sure that benefits and quality of life for family are really strong so that people that are skilled don't leave. But the military has been making strides in terms of civilian standard recognition as part of their military training. So the Air Force has done this. The Navy has started doing this so that you can, concurrent with your military training, receive civilian accreditations as well. This is something that is recent in the last 10 years. This allows outside companies or industry to recognize military service in a way that they just didn't in the past. And I think that's going to continue. I'm a member of a veterans group called Treble Victor. Treble Victor has worked with industry on veteran hiring programs. Actually, I was involved in planning, and then I was elected as an MP, and I attended the conference as an elected official in between planning it and attending it. And it was called Battlefields to Boardrooms, where we were trying to show companies that the experience you'd get as a junior officer or as a junior NCO would be equivalent to some of the training programs that they would provide their own workforces. We're making strides in that. Canada Company, another great Canadian charity, has done this by educating the C-suite, educating the CEO on the benefits of hiring veterans. So while there's still barriers, Duncan, we have come so far. And now I see so many people. In fact, tomorrow I'm connecting with a good friend who happens to be in Toronto, served with distinction in Afghanistan. His name's Austin Douglas, and he's in town. He now works for General Dynamics, and we're going to connect. I get to stay in touch with so many people I served with, and then so many people I met in my role as veterans minister and as conservative leader. So there's still barriers, but we're making a lot of strides.
Aaron, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has kind of highlighted a real change in warfare, and you and Duncan would know this much better than I would, but it seems like it's a different kind of war. It's almost World War I trenches and then World War III drones. What kind of conflict does Canada need to be prepared for? What kind of equipment will we need as an outcome of all this new spending?
That's a great question, and I'm asked this a lot because a lot of people now are following defense issues that were certainly not following it even 3 or 4 years ago. And I get a lot of questions about this now. And so when a lot of young men have said to me, oh, Elon Musk says we don't need fighter jets anymore, let's just buy drones. We are actually at what I would call the sort of tipping point of defense tech, where we actually need the traditional platforms, but we also need the traditional platforms to integrate with the new innovation. And this really is Army, Navy, Air Force. It really doesn't matter. So what does that mean? It means that our next generation fighter, which will be the F-35 for at least 16 of them, we're kind of holding out the US thing. We might not buy all of them, but we could probably buy 20 fewer of them and incorporate this a collaborative combat aircraft drone model to accompany them. That's kind of the future. So we see this in some of the comments about submarines. Why aren't we just buying autonomous surface vehicles? Well, we're not quite there yet. People can see it, see the drone example in Ukraine as a good one, but we're not at the stage where we can just say, okay, we're all drones and we're no traditional piloted aircraft. So what we have to be very deliberate in doing is making sure our choices about procurement now incorporate this enhanced defense tech. And you're seeing this in the United States with companies like Anduril, Palantir, our defense technology companies that are really shaking up the older establishment military industrial complex, as President Eisenhower once said. That type of innovation we can do here. I already see it happening here as well. And we should make sure that if we do any of this innovation, that it's completely Canadian and that we control the IP and we control the levers of manufacturing. Because as we saw in the pandemic, when the US wouldn't even let masks made in Michigan be sent to Windsor, N95 masks, you remember that? In a time of crisis, we can only count on ourselves. So we need to be more self-sufficient. And in defense and military areas, we need the ability to scale up ammunition, scale up drones without relying on even our closest traditional allies for that capacity, because they're going to supply their own country first.
And would you see opportunities for dual-use technologies that could serve both defense and commercial markets?
100%. The drone example is a great example. Like many things, Canadians were some of the innovators in this space. I remember when we were in the Harper government and I was promoting the European trade deal that we were finalizing, which will come in very handy now that we have to diversify. But I toured this amazing drone facility, a startup company, Arion Labs in Kitchener-Waterloo, doing incredible stuff. And now we're talking 2013, so we're talking 12 years ago. What happened? They were acquired, right, by a U.S. player. That's unfortunately what happens too much in Canada. And, Duncan, you guys at Tidal would see this broadly in the space, is we're really good at ideas and startup. We're not as good at scale up. And so how can we, in the case of drones, and I've known a few shops like this, make sure that the goal of these founders is not just to grow and sell to the US. The goal now is to come up with the ideas, get the venture capital, scale it, build market opportunities in Canada and Europe and the US, depending on where their head is at in 1 year or another. And this is a role where the public and private sectors can come together, because you need that private sector innovation. You need that creativity, that destructive creativity, breaking down old ideas. But BDC is being tasked probably with $1 billion defense scaling fund that they're probably going to announce in the next couple of weeks, or they may wait to the budget. We'll see. That will be there to help these companies scale from a 12-person shop with a couple of patents and great ideas to 300 and being world-class. And I think there's a role for public money so that we have this capability in case the world is even more dangerous 5 years from now. So I think the dual use opportunities, particularly in tech, but also in manufacturing. There's a great company I used to deal with years ago, Maritime Composites in Atlantic. They can build for anybody and for any use. So can we use BDC money to help them scale up a new dual use military usage from their civilian usage? There's dozens. I think the Canadian Council of Innovators and the great online publication, The Icebreaker, just released a study with about 500 dual use companies that they've already identified in Canada through this CCI survey. The Globe and Mail just wrote about their findings the other day. That's across the country. That's Atlantic to Pacific, where they may not all do it, but we do have the capacity for dual use, and we've got to really map out who needs a bit of that federal assistance to scale up.
From your perspective, I mean, a lot of those small and medium businesses, they've got the energy, and we think we need to get them alongside some of those people who've got the experience. Might be the veterans or people who are still serving, with open doors to enable innovation. But what do you think we can be doing nationally to really speed up the way in which those small and medium businesses can get to success? I mean, part of the reason I ask that is because I've always got questions in my head, and there's always a degree of cynicism in terms of what's coming down the track, and looking at that in a way which is slightly more circumspect than I tend to. But I had a conversation with two of the senior people at EDC, so Export Development Canada, and they basically recently have said, well, we're looking for what we want to do, and we need the help and assistance. And the discussion we were having was very, very fruitful. But they admitted, we've blacklisted defence for 18 years. So what we're talking about is really significant things. And I just wonder if there's some mechanisms that you've seen that might help to accelerate that program that we can apply to help the small and medium businesses and the operators, because it's the operators, not defence. It's not DND that needs the capability. It's our soldiers, sailors, aviators, and the really good operators that work in national defence and security.
You've raised a very, very important point, Duncan. Look at the government agencies in the past. EDC, BDC, they had a no-go zone on defense. In fact, they were given a mandate, particularly under the Trudeau government, but it even predates that. Those agencies not only didn't have the capacity to assess investments or loans to or contract securitizations for defense companies, they weren't permitted to by their mandates. That's changing. CCC, the other C, as I call it, from the government, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, was created for defense, but that was only created because the U.S., back at the height of the good days of our relationship, granted Canada in the 50s access through the Defense Production Sharing Agreement. It allowed Canadian companies to sell directly into the U.S. as prime or secondary on U.S. DoD contracts. We were the only country in the world that had that for 50 years. Australia has that now. So CCC was the vehicle that guaranteed this work as part of that agreement. But they were the unknown agency of the federal government. I would talk to people that had never heard of CCC, even though, for example, the light armored vehicle contract with Saudi Arabia, the LAVs built out of London, Ontario, that was a CCC facilitated contract. So the largest export contract in Canadian history was a CCC contract, but nobody even knew what the agency did. Now there's a whole of government approach. So I've spoken to EDC and to BDC. They know the world has changed. They now have the ability to move into this area, and they are building capacity to support it. My advice to them has to been build up capacity so that you can provide transparency and accountability for taxpayer dollars, but don't create a bureaucracy. You need to get money out the door. So you need to make sure you're doing your job of basic diligence and get it out the door. You're going to see the two big things I said. The BDC fund for defense will be a really big thing that will help the founders and the employees in these companies that you were talking about, Duncan. The other thing that we may see in the budget is Mark Carney committed to flow-through shares when he was running for office. Now, this is an idea he did lift exactly out of our platform from 2021. I'm a big fan of flow-through shares because if you dedicate a couple of areas of the economy where you want to allow investors from the private sector to be able to have some of the costs of these losses of these startup companies flowed through as a tax advantage to the investor, it can bring a ton of money from the sidelines really quickly. Flow-through shares exist for mining companies in Canada, and mining finance is the only area of the world that Canada is the leader in. That's it. In terms of financial markets, the only thing Canada and the TSX are leaders in is mining finance. Flow-through shares are part of that. So if in the budget in October, they say, we're going to allow for the next 5 years flow-through shares for defense, Canadian-based, Canadian IP defense companies of a certain size and green tech companies, for example, you will see a lot of private capital flowing into these areas because there is a tax benefit to the people taking the risk. Why I like them is if you're a sophisticated investor, you're not going to just throw your money away. You're still going to look at who has the promising technology. Where do you think you can get a return? So while they're In the startup phase, you get the benefit of the tax assist of the flow through expenses, but you get the upside down the road.
Yes.
So I really hope that Carney makes defense tech one of the areas of eligibility for flow through shares.
Let's hope he's listening to this and he takes that one forwards and pinches from you as well. It's a great perspective, and I think one which would be very, very beneficial. Just, in some respects, again, I come back to some of the teams I speak to here in Atlantic Canada, and I always refer to it as the fact that whenever you're trying to deal with any of the larger defence companies, it feels like their back is turned to Atlantic Canada. There's some exceptions, of course, because of the great work which is being done in Halifax, particularly with regards to the CSC. But I just wonder if somebody was to ask you, as an Atlantic Canadian businessman or woman, what could I do better to raise our profile, or what could be better conducted to raise our profile in a national perspective? What would you advise them to do?
I would advise them to get involved in some of the great work that's already happening. So the defense industry nationally, CADSI, the Canadian Aerospace Defense Securities Industry, is run by my RMC classmate, Kristen Sanfriani, a veteran. She worked for CAE, bilingual, great leader. CADSI's CanSec show every spring in Ottawa is incredible, bringing together the sector. And this last year, they blew all their records out of the door in terms of participants' interest. But the great thing is Atlantic Canada has one too, ACADA. So it has the Atlantic Canadian Aerospace and Defense Association. It also has COVE, a really good venture-focused innovation hub in Halifax. Last time I was there, Melanie Nadeau, the CEO, gave me a tour. I got to see the sort of hub they're creating. So there are advocacy organizations that are quite strong, already on the ground, advocating for Atlantic Canadians. Duncan, you're in Fredericton. Fredericton's a little hub for cyber. I've toured the cyber facility just outside Fredericton. I spoke at a cyber conference in Calgary just this week. There is a little hub. There are advocates there to make sure that the sector gets its voice heard. Conversations like this are important. So I think East of Montreal is a perfect title for your podcast, because we need the government to pay attention east of Montreal. Canada exists outside of the Windsor, Quebec City corridor. Yep. And there's some great innovation happening in Atlantic Canada and some real patriots. I was talking to John Risley a month ago about his Arctic Economic Development Corporation. He's got a shipping business now that is looking to do more on defense security in the Arctic. You've got IMP, you've got Irving, Fleetway, you've got a number of big established players, and then you've got a number of smaller, almost startups. So you've got a really good ecosystem. Atlantic Canada punches well above its per capita weight in defense and in innovation. So yeah, just have your voice heard, and there's strength in numbers. So get involved with ACADA, get involved with CADSI, support the events done by COVE. I'm speaking in September at the Atlantic ACG conference, the Association for Corporate Growth, on September 25th, and I'm speaking on defense at Pier 21. So there's a lot happening. Just make sure that companies are a part of it.
I'm sure Victoria Belbin, who's the CEO of ACADA, will be really glad to hear, ACADA being highlighted there, because they are a great organisation. They provide fantastic value for all of their member companies and also the associated organisations. And one of the things that they've been really good at is pulling in the universities. And here in Fredericton, the University of New Brunswick has just hosted a global forum to that point on privacy, security and trust. It's very clear that, they are leading across the nation in those national security areas that are behind the veil for most people. They're things that aren't talked about in public, but really are behind some of the great analysis that we do as a nation on state attacks that are happening on our national infrastructure as well. And I think that really, in some respects, is probably where, if I was to ask you another question right now, it would be on the national security side rather than on the traditional defense of capability side of things. the way in which we're developing as a nation, do you see scope for significant changes in the structure of defence and how we innovate for that future threats that we're facing that are very clear and present part of the war in the Ukraine, for instance, but are also leading, senior advisors and politicians in Europe to say we're already at war?
My speech this week in Calgary, I told you I was talking a lot about sovereign capability recently, the ability for us to build our own ships, as we've been doing at the Irving shipyard in Halifax, to be able to produce our own drones, ammunition, this sort of stuff. That's one part of it. The other part is actually our digital sovereignty. And this is something I talk about regularly. Jim Balzilli, one of the strongest voice on this nationally. And that's to make sure that we have sovereign control over data, how large language models use or don't use Canadians' personal information, and how sensitive information in Canada, both proprietary and government, is stored. It would shock people to know that a month and a half ago in France, Microsoft officials there had to admit that there was no guarantee of privacy for the information of French citizens stored on French soil to not be accessed by the U.S. administration, the U.S. government. That should scare people. Seeing what, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump in his first term, John Bolton, just had his house raided a week ago. So should we actually be relying on foreign cloud and foreign AI? I don't think so in this environment. Now, these are security and digital infrastructure investments that are massive, but we cannot be over reliant on an ally that is no longer as reliable. And so I really liked the government's announcement that they're going to look at using Cohere, which is a Canadian AI company, probably one of the best in the world. We need sovereign cloud capability for security. And on this, you talked about security in the context of defense and threat preparation. We also need domestic cyber tools and even domestic intelligence gathering. So it's only in the last few years that Canada has permitted CSIS to leave Canada to collect intelligence. We didn't have a foreign intelligence agency until very recently. We've been able to give them. We may not be able to rely on our Five Eyes security and intelligence access in the next few years. So we have to build up a bit of capacity. I like to joke that Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, trained at Camp X in Ontario, in the Durham region. And he was living near a church called St. James Bond United, was blocks from where he lived. So Ian Fleming was not only, and he was part of the Dieppe raid. So Ian Fleming was really almost an unofficial member of the Canadian military in World War II. He stayed near James Bond Church, and we now know James Bond was inspired by a Canadian church on Avenue Road in Toronto. But we need homegrown James Bonds. We need the ability to gather intelligence just in case we get shut off from intelligence from our U.S. friends. So that's a big order that I've just thrown you there, but that's the world we live in. We're well behind where we need to be.
Yeah,
it's almost hard to believe, but we're barely a year into Donald Trump's mandate, and the changes and the havoc that he's wreaked has been tremendous already. What do the next 3 years look like, and do we have enough time as a nation to respond to that?
Well, people in military and intelligence circles, as Duncan would know, you never have enough time, but you make do with the time you have. Time appreciation is something that Duncan would have taught our young infantry soldiers at Gagetown. How do you use the time you have to prioritize the greatest need? So that's what the government is now seized with. The fact that Prime Minister Carney said we're going to make 2% this year. As I said, he's going to fall a little short technically, but I admired that ambition. The Globe and Mail had a writer this week that thanked Donald Trump for actually getting us out of our complacency and getting us out of our sort of naivete, really, So do we have enough time to be as ready as we might like? No. But I think the national conversation has changed so much. It's hard being out of politics now because all of the issues I droned on about for years, military, 2%, the Arctic, veterans, all of this stuff is super hot now. Years ago, I was kind of like a novelty, and the press gallery would roll their eyes at me when I said we needed to spend more on defense. Now, your average Canadian realizes we need to do more. We need to be more self-reliant. So there's really a Canadian moment we're having here where if we scale up as quickly as we can, if we can prioritize expenditures as well as we can, I think we can be ready. But we have to realize to people, even if we get a deal this fall with President Trump that is somewhat acceptable, a lower general tariff, some dropping of the 51st state rhetoric, if we get into a new normal, let's not ever go back to the complacent ways. So I hope this was the wake up of a generation and that Canada is more prepared just generally and more self-reliant. I do think Canadians see this. So let's not lose this moment we have to accelerate these investments and this development. But I think we will be ready and we'll be thankful for it maybe 3 years from now.
The way that I'd like to close is just by thanking you for all of the things that you've just brought to us there, Erin, in a very frank and open way, and I appreciate that very much. And also just for, in some respects, that inspiration for anybody that's here listening to this program can get, whether they're on the policy side, whether they're in an institutional organization, or whether they're that small or medium business operator who's thinking, how do I make that next step? How do I get to where I'm going to help Canada achieve the mission? Because that's one of the things I think that really, I think we're waking up now, and it really is underlined by what you've just said about that wake up call that we've had. We've woken up and we've suddenly realized as a nation, we need to get to somewhere that's going to be a hard place to get to. This isn't going to be easy. This is going to need everybody to work together. But at the same time, what we've got is absolutely phenomenal resources as a nation. We've got the innovation, we've got the determination. I'll just use one expression, and this is not in a disparaging way. I served alongside the Canadian Forces a number of times overseas in Afghanistan and the Balkans in particular. And my own regiment is the sister regiment of the Royal Canadian Regiment. Combat lumberjacks. Let's get in there and let's get done what we need to do more effectively than anybody else can do this, because that's what we've got a reputation as a nation for doing. And I think a lot of what you've just threaded into this conversation that we've been having this afternoon is really pointed in that direction. It's giving really great indications of what we're thinking about at the top level as a nation, and also what we can individually do in the roles that we have to be able to achieve that. So I think that's really sort of, it's one of those, it's a great thing to be able to do at this time in the week and to have those conversations. So I just genuinely appreciate that. But also just the pointers that you've had to help people just reach out to the support networks that are there. And if I was to ask you for one closing comment, it would be, where do we need to go as a nation with those small and medium businesses? How do we galvanize them into that coherence which is needed? Is that through dollars? Is it through programs? Or is it just through letting people get on with what they want to get on with?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I like that combat lumberjack sort of approach. We need to get her done, so to speak. And as my father used to say, hard work builds character. We've got some hard work ahead of us, but it will mean Canada is stronger. And so that's the last word I would say, is what small and medium-sized businesses need is predictability. They need to know that the government's going to be committed to this for the long term, and that there's going to be the ability to help them scale, that there's going to be the ability for us to access the European market, not just us buy stuff from Europe. We need to be able to sell some of our expertise. And with that predictability and funding will come the confidence that we need, because particularly east of Montreal, we've got resilient, hardworking, patriotic people that can step up to this challenge. Our greatest strength is our people and our resources, as you said. We can meet this challenge. We can meet this moment. but we have to have the confidence to do the hard work that's needed. So conversations like this are very important. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Aaron. We really appreciate your time, your insights on defense and innovation and Canada's role in a changing world, and even your carefully chosen words on the Canadian political scene. We know you have a deep appreciation for Atlantic Canada, and the feeling is mutual. So thank you for your time, and thanks for joining us on East of Montreal. We'll see you next time.
Oh, the year was 1778. How I wish I was in Sherbrooke now.
You've been listening to East of Montreal, a part of the Acadia Broadcasting Network.